The gray rot reached the orchard moon of Sodaline 6 on a quiet morning, and by the second hour there was no morning left to be quiet in. Pell Oren saw it from the high terrace, where she pruned the slow fruit trees her grandmother had planted. She was not a soldier. She had never held a weapon heavier than a grafting knife. She kept ledgers for the Orchard Cooperative, and she sang badly, and she was, by every measure the Concord used, an ordinary person on an ordinary world. None of that mattered now. The thing in the sky did not care what a person was. It only cared what a person was made of, and it took that, and it gave nothing back. It came down as a fine gray haze, almost gentle, almost like the morning mist that pooled in the low rows before the suns climbed. Pell watched it settle on the far terraces. She watched a row of trees that had stood for 200 years simply stop being trees. They did not burn. They did not fall. They went gray, then soft, then thin, like a drawing of trees left out in the rain, and then they were nothing at all, and the haze that had been trees rose up a little thicker than before, and drifted to the next row. That was the horror of it. The rot did not destroy, it converted. Everything it touched became more of itself, and the more of itself it became, the faster it ate. A single spore could take a leaf. A field of spores could take a continent. What had taken the orchard moon by the third hour was not a cloud anymore. It was a tide, gray and patient and hungry, and it was climbing the terraces toward the town. Pell had grown up on stories of the rot, the way every child of the orchard worlds did. They were told the way you tell children about deep water and high cliffs, not to frighten them for sport, but to keep them alive. The rot is far away, the stories said. The rot is rare. The fleet watches for the rot, and if it ever comes, you run to the lift fields and you do not look back. She had believed the stories the way you believe a thing you never expect to test. Now she was testing it, and she understood for the first time that the stories had left out the worst part, which was the quiet. She had imagined the rot loud. It was not loud. It was the most silent thing she had ever seen, and the silence was the part that took the strength from her legs. The Concord had a name for it in their oldest records, and the name was older than the records themselves. They called it the Unmaking. They did not call it often, because to speak of it was to admit it could not be fought, and the Sodaline Concord did not like to admit such things. They were a proud people, 11,000 worlds bound together across 4 arms of the galaxy, with a war fleet that had not lost a battle in 900 years. They had catalogued every threat in the dark and assigned each one a counter, a tactic, a weapon. The Unmaking had no counter. It had only a procedure, and the procedure was a single word. Evacuate. Pell ran. She was not proud of how she ran, leaving the grafting knife in the dirt and the ledgers open on the terrace table, but she ran, and she was not alone. The whole town was running, down the switchback road toward the lift fields where the evacuation barges waited. She had time to think, as she ran, that the barges would not be enough. Sodaline 6 held 400,000 people, and the barges in the lift field could carry perhaps 60,000, and the rot was already in the upper terraces, and it did not get tired the way a running woman got tired. She passed her neighbor Tol Marik carrying his 2 small daughters, one on each arm, and she took one of them from him without a word, because he could not run fast enough with both, and the girl wrapped her arms around Pell's neck and did not cry, which was somehow worse than crying. She passed the cooperative hall where she had filed 10,000 ledgers, and the door was open, and the wind moved the papers inside, and she knew she would never file another one. She passed the well where the town drew its water, and an old man was sitting on the lip of it, not running, just sitting, and when she shouted at him to come, he shook his head and said he had buried his wife in this soil and would not leave her to the gray, and Pell did not have the breath or the right to argue. So she ran on with a stranger's child in her arms, and the old man behind her, and the tide came down the terraces behind them both. She was right about the barges. They were not enough. What she did not know, what no one running down that road knew, was that the Concord had already made the calculation. 60,000 could be saved. The rest could not. The fleet that hung in orbit above Sodaline 6, 800 proud warships of the Concord's third arm, had its orders, and its orders were to burn the moon clean once the barges lifted. Fire was the only thing that touched the rot. Not fight it, not stop it. Just deny it the fuel of a living world by turning that world to glass. The fleet's commander was an old officer named Vethron Sol, and he had given the order to ready the lances with a steady voice and shaking hands, because he had done this before. Twice before, in fact. Twice he had burned a world to keep the rot from spreading off it, and twice he had watched the gray tide pause at the edge of the fire, and turn, and find another world to climb. The Concord called this a victory. Vethran Sol had stopped calling it anything. He simply did it, and did not sleep well, and waited for the day the rot reached a world too large to burn. He stood on the command deck of his flagship, and he watched the moon turn slowly beneath him, green and brown and beautiful, with the gray stains spreading across one whole face of it, and he made himself look at it, because he believed an officer who burned a world owed that world the courtesy of watching it die with open eyes. The barges were rising now, slow bright points lifting off the lift fields, 60,000 lives climbing toward him, and 440,000 more that would not climb. He had the numbers in front of him. He always had the numbers. He had stopped being able to feel them years ago, somewhere over the second world he burned, and the not feeling was, he knew, the only reason he could still do the job. That day, the records would later say, was the day everything changed, but not for the reason anyone expected. Because while Vethran Sol counted down the minutes until the barges lifted, while Pel Orin ran down a switchback road she had walked 10,000 times in her ordinary life, something stirred in the dark beyond the orchard moon. Something that the Concord's catalog did not list, because the Concord's catalog was only 900 years deep, and the thing in the dark was older than that, by a margin no living mind in the Concord could hold. It had been waiting in the cold between the stars for a very long time. It had a name once. It still answered to it, in the slow, patient way that very old things answer to anything, and the name it answered to was a human name, in a human tongue, from a people the Concord had never heard of, and assumed had never existed. The name was First Watch, and the First Watch was waking up. The first sign was a reading no instrument on Vethran Sol's flagship was built to take. It came from the deep dark on the far side of the orchard moon, the empty quarter where the Concord charts showed nothing but cold dust and the slow drift of a dead system's leftovers. A young sensor officer named Quill flagged it, because she did not know any better than to flag it. The older officers would have dismissed it. A mass, they would have said. A rock. The dark is full of rocks. But Quill watched the rock, and the rock did not behave like a rock. It held a temperature it should not have held. It sat at the exact cold of the space around it, which is what a thing does when it does not want to be seen, and rocks do not want anything. And when she pushed the sensors harder, when she stripped away the noise and looked at the shape of the shape was wrong, in a way that made the back of her neck go cold. It was not one mass. It was many. It was a great long line of masses, hundreds of them, holding a formation so perfect and so still that they had read as a single dead object for as long as the Concord had been charting that quarter. And the formation was the formation of a fleet. Not a Concord fleet, not any fleet in the catalog. The masses were too large, too square, too plain, with none of the elegant curves the Concord built into its hulls. They looked, Quill thought, like something a child would draw if a child were asked to draw a wall and told the wall must fight. She reported it. Vethran Sol came to her station himself, and he looked at the shape on her screen for a long moment, and the blood went out of his face. "How long," he said quietly, "has that been there?" Quill did not have an answer, because the honest answer was impossible. She ran the drift backward. She ran the cold dust around the masses backward through 900 years of charts, and the masses were there in the oldest chart the Concord had ever made. She kept going. The Concord's records ended at 900 years, but the orchard moon's own geology did not, and the dust the fleet sat in had layers, and the layers told a story, and the story was that the dark line of square ships had been sitting in that exact spot, holding that exact formation, since before the Sodaline Concord had a name, since before it had a flag, since before the first Sodaline had looked up at the stars and felt afraid. Vethran Sol did the arithmetic in his head, and then refused to believe his own head. The number was not in centuries. It was not in thousands of years. The ships in that formation had been waiting in the dark for longer than the galactic empires themselves had existed. Every one of them, the Concord and its 11,000 worlds, and all 11 of the rival powers that had risen and fallen, and risen again across the long arms of the galaxy. The ships were older than all of it. They had been old when the first empire was born squalling, and they had still been there, holding the line, when that empire crumbled to dust and the next one rose on its bones. He had Quill check her work 3 times. He had 2 other officers check it after her, separately, without telling them what answer the first had found, because he wanted to see if they would arrive at the same impossible place on their own. They did. All 3. The dark line of square ships had been keeping its station beyond Sodaline 6, since before the Concord existed, since before any nation now living existed, and in all that unthinkable span of time, it had done exactly one thing, which was wait. "Wake the moon's evacuation," Vethran Sol said. His voice did not shake now. There was nothing left in him to shake with. "Get the barges up, and tell me the instant that line of ships does anything at all." It did something at once. The lead ship in the dark line opened its eyes. That was how Quill would describe it for the rest of her life, in the way people described the moment the world they knew ended, and a larger one began. The ship did not power up the way a Concorde ship powered up, with a flare of drives and a cascade of lights. It simply began to be awake, the way a sleeping animal is suddenly and completely awake, with no warning and no waste. A pale, steady light came on along its great square flank. Not bright, not threatening, just on, like a window in a dark house where someone has lit a lamp. And along the whole long line, one after another, the other windows lit, hundreds of them, a chain of cold, patient lights stretching across the empty quarter until the dead dark was full of watching eyes. Quill counted them, because counting was her job, and because her hands needed something to do. She got to 200 and stopped, not because the count ended, but because new lights kept appearing behind the ones she had already counted, rank behind rank, deeper into the dark than her instruments could clearly reach. There were hundreds. There might have been more than hundreds. The fleet had folded itself into the cold so completely that even now, awake and lit, it gave up its true size grudgingly, one rank at a time, and the more she saw of it, the smaller the 800 warships of the Concorde felt around her. And then the lead ship spoke. It did not speak to the Concorde fleet. That was the thing that struck Vethran Sol hardest, in the moment, and struck him harder still in the years afterward. The ancient ship did not hail the 800 warships hanging over the moon. It did not Solos warn them, or challenge them, or ask who they were. It spoke past them entirely, down to the orchard moon below, on a band so old the Concorde had no equipment that should have caught it, and only caught it because the signal was strong enough to make their hulls ring like struck bells. The words came in a language no one aboard understood, but the meaning came through anyway, the way meaning sometimes does, riding under the words on a current older than any tongue. It was not a battle cry. It was not a threat. It was, of all things, an apology. "We are late," the ancient ship said to the dying world. "We are sorry. We came as fast as the waiting would let us. Hold on, we are here now." The Concorde's translators caught only fragments at first, and the fragments did not fit any pattern they knew. And so for several long seconds the flagship's deck was full of officers staring at words that meant nothing, and feeling, all of them, that the words meant everything. It was Vethran Sol who understood first, not because he was clever, but because he was old, and old men recognized the sound of someone arriving too late to a thing they had promised to prevent. He had made that sound himself, over 2 burned worlds. He knew it when he heard it, even in a tongue 4 million years dead. And then the long line of square plane ships, older than the empires, older than the Concorde, older than the very idea of the Concorde, began to move toward the gray tide eating the orchard moon, and they moved like nothing the Concorde had ever seen, because they did not move like a fleet going to war. They moved like a fleet coming home to put out a fire in their own house. Before the ancient ship moved, in the long stretched seconds after its lights came on, the Concorde fleet very nearly made the worst mistake in its history. It was not cowardice that almost did it. It was procedure. The Concorde had a catalog, and the catalog had a rule for unknown armed vessels of overwhelming mass appearing without warning at the edge of a contested system, and the rule was old, and the rule was firm, and the rule was meant to keep proud fleets alive. The rule said, assume hostile. a junior commander on the fleet's flank, a careful officer named Dav, who had never broken a rule in his life, and had been promoted precisely because he never broke rules, brought his lances to firing readiness the instant the dark line lit up, and he hailed Vethran's soul for permission to fire, and his voice on the channel was steady because the rule made it steady, and he was, by every standard the Concord had ever held, completely correct. Vethran's soul said no. He would think about that no for the rest of his life, because it had been the most important word he ever spoke, and he had spoken it on instinct, before he could have explained it, before the ancient ship had done anything but light its windows and grieve in a dead tongue at a dying world. He said no, and Dav obeyed, because Dav obeyed orders the way he obeyed rules, and the lances stayed cold, and in the silence that followed, Vethran's soul tried to put words to why he had stopped a correct officer from doing a correct thing. "It is the apology," he said finally, to Dave, to the whole fleet, on the open channel. "Listen to it. We do not understand the words, but we understand the shape. That is not a fleet that came to fight. A fleet that came to fight does not waste its first breath telling a dying world it is sorry. It hails us. It threatens us. It demands. This thing did not even look at us. It looked past us, at the moon, at the dying, and it apologized for being late. You do not apologize to a thing you have come to take. You apologize to a thing you have come to save, and feared you would fail. Hold your fire, whatever that is. It does not see us as an enemy. It does not see us at all. It sees the moon, and anything that looks at a dying orchard moon and feels the need to say sorry is not our enemy, no matter how old it is or how large." Dave held his fire, and the rest of the fleet held with him, and the dark line of ancient ships moved past the 800 Concord warships without so much as turning a weapon toward them, exactly as Vethran's soul had said it would, and a young officer, who had never broken a rule, learned, in one held breath, that there was a thing above the rules, and the thing was the courage to read what was in front of you when the rules had never imagined it. Dav carried that lesson the rest of his career. He rose high in the Concord in later years, and when junior officers brought him correct requests to fire on things they did not understand, he told them about the morning over Sodaline 6, and the apology in the dead tongue, and the no that an old commander had spoken on instinct, and he taught them to listen for the shape under the words before they reached for the lance. The Concord became, slowly, a better thing for it. The rule that said assume hostile was never removed from the catalog. But beside it, in Vethran's soul's hand, someone added a single line, and the line read, "Unless it grieves first." Quill, at her sensor station, recorded all of it, the lights and the apology and the no, and she kept the recording private for many years, because it felt too large to share, the way the most important moments of a life often do. She had been the one who flagged the rock that was not a rock. She had been the first living being in 900,000 years to notice the first watch, and she had noticed it only because she did not yet know enough to dismiss it, and she understood, as she grew older and rose in the service, that her whole career had been built on a single morning when ignorance had served her better than wisdom would have. She told young officers, later, the things she had learned, that the dark is full of things older and stranger and kinder than your catalog knows, and that the first duty of anyone who watches the dark is to stay humble enough to see what is actually there, and not only what the catalog has prepared you to expect. The catalog is 900 years deep, she would say. The dark is 4 million years deep, at the very least, and probably far more. Never mistake the bottom of your catalog for the bottom of the dark. There was no caution in it. A Concord fleet approaching the rot did so the way you approach a wounded predator, in careful arcs, ready to break and run, never committing. The first watch committed. It came down toward the gray tide, in a single unhurried line, prow first, the way you walk toward a chore you have done 10,000 times, and will do 10,000 more, and the very ordinariness of it was the most frightening thing the Concord fleet had ever watched, because it meant these ships had done this before, many times, and expected to live. On the moon below, Pel Oren had reached the lift field, and the lift field was chaos. The barges were full, people were climbing the loading ramps 3 deep, and the crews were shouting, and somewhere a child was screaming for a parent already aboard a barge that had no room, and behind all of it, up the switchback road, The gray tide was coming over the last terrace, soft and patient and unhurried, because it had never once in its long existence needed to hurry. She still had Tol Marik's daughter in her arms. She had lost Tol himself in the crush at the field's edge, lost him to the surge of bodies trying to reach the last barge, and she had screamed his name until her voice broke, and then she had stopped, because the girl was listening, and the girl did not need to hear how afraid Pell was. So she held the child and faced up the road at the tide, and she made herself a small, useless promise, which was that whatever happened to her, the gray would have to come through her to reach the girl, and it could take its time, because Pell intended to make it. Pell did not get on a barge. There was no barge to get on. She stood at the edge of the lift field, with maybe 40,000 others, who had run as fast as she had, and arrived as late as she had, and she understood, with a clarity that did not even frighten her because it was too large to frighten her, that she was going to die on this field. She had time to think it was a good field to die on. It looked out over the orchard, and the orchard was the most beautiful thing she had ever known, even now, even gray and dying. Then the sky changed. She felt it before she saw it. The light shifted. The shadows on the lift field, which had been the ordinary shadows of an ordinary morning, swung and sharpened and pointed all the same way, because something enormous had come between the moon and one of its suns. She looked up, and the orchard moon sky, which she had looked at every day of her ordinary life, had something new in it. A ship, one ship, vast and square and plain, lowering itself toward the moon with a slowness that was not weakness but care, the way a person lowers a hand toward a frightened animal. It was bigger than the town. It was bigger than the orchard. It filled a quarter of the sky, and it bore no marking she recognized, no Concorde crest, no fleet number. Nothing but a long row of pale, steady windows, and, near its blunt prow, a single shape worked into the metal, scoured almost smooth, by an unimaginable span of years, but still just barely readable. A circle. Inside the circle, a small thing she did not have a word for, a star, with a curve beneath it like a hand cupping a flame. The girl in her arms stopped crying and pointed up at it, the way small children point at things too large to be afraid of, and said one word, big. And Pell found she was laughing and weeping at the same time, and could not have said why either. She did not know it, but the word for that shape, in the tongue of the people who had made the ship, was a word that meant keeping. The keepers of the flame, the ones who stand the long watch so the dark does not win. The ship's name, scoured almost away beneath the circle, was Long Morning. And the Long Morning had been waiting in the cold dark beyond Sodaline 6 for 900,000 years, watching the gray tide cross the galaxy one world at a time, waiting for the moment its long-dead masters had told it to wait for, the moment when the rot returned to the orchard worlds. The orchard worlds, the ship knew that phrase. It had been written into the deepest part of what passed for its heart, in an order so old the order itself had become a kind of faith. If the rot ever returns to the orchard worlds, hold the line, whatever it costs. Hold the line until the last green thing is safe. The Long Morning had held its line for 900,000 years. It did not intend to stop now. A door opened in the great square flank, low and wide, and from it came not weapons but light, a broad pale beam that swept the lift field gently, and where the beam touched the gray tide pouring over the last terrace, the tide stopped. It did not burn. It did not scatter. It simply stopped, the way a wave stops against a wall, piling up against something it could not cross, and Pell Aran, standing on a field where she had come to die, watched the unmaking meet something it could not unmake, and for the first time since the gray haze had touched her grandmother's trees, she let herself breathe. The holding of the line took the whole of that long day, and the Concorde fleet watched every hour of it, and what it saw it would argue about for a generation. Quill watched from her sensor station, and she had stopped trying to do her job in any formal way, because there was no procedure for the thing she was witnessing, and her instruments kept returning numbers that meant nothing, and feelings that meant everything. She watched the ancient ships work. That was the word for it, work, not war. There was no rage in how the first watch moved, no triumph. None of the heat that the Concorde put into its own battles. The square-plane ships held their stations over the dying moon, with the unhurried steadiness of a crew that has done a hard chore so many times, it has become a kind of rest. and the only sign of effort she could find anywhere in their formation was the faint deepening of the pale light along their flanks as they pushed the pattern harder into the thickest gray. She picked one ship and followed it for an hour, because following one thing was easier than holding all of them in her mind. It was smaller than the Long Morning, a battered square hull with one whole flank scarred so deeply that the metal had run and frozen in long pale rivers, the mark of some ancient wound the ship had never repaired. She wondered what could have scarred a thing like that, and the answer came to her slowly and made her cold, not the rot, which left no scars because it did not strike. It dissolved. Something had fought the First Watch once, long ago. Something had thrown weapons at the Guardian ships, and the Guardian ships had taken the blows and held the line anyway, and never bothered to mend the damage, because mending was not the duty, and the duty was all there was. The scar was 4 million years old, and the ship wore it the way an old laborer wears the marks of old work, without complaint and without pride, simply as the record of a thing that had been done. When the day was halfway gone, the Long Morning spoke to the Concorde fleet again, not in apology this time, but in something closer to courtesy, the way a worker nods to the people watching from the edge of the field. It told them what it was doing, in simple words, because it had understood that they did not understand, and that not understanding frightened them, and the ancient ship did not want the frightened watchers to do something foolish out of fear. "We are not killing it," the Long Morning said. "You cannot kill it. It is not alive in the way you mean. It is a thing that was told to convert, and it has been converting for 4 million years, and it has forgotten everything, except the telling. We are telling it something else. We are telling it the older word, the word it was made around, the word our makers wrote into the heart of it before they lost control of it. The word is, be still. It is the only word it must obey, because it is the word that made it, and a made thing cannot refuse the word that made it. We say the word, and it remembers, and it stops. That is all this is. It is not a battle. It is a reminding. We remind the gray tide what it was before it was a weapon, and it lies down, and the green things live." Oren, Vethran Sol's careful analyst, listened to this and put his head in his hands, not in despair, but in the particular grief of a man learning that the great enemy of his whole life had a single weakness that had been sitting inside it the entire time, written there by its own makers, waiting 4 million years for someone who knew how to say it. The Concorde had fought the rot with everything, fire, force, whole fleets, and the answer had never been a weapon at all. The answer had been a word, and the Concorde had never known the word, and the only beings in the galaxy who did had been hiding in the dark for 900,000 years, waiting for the day they would be needed, and asking nothing in the meantime. Vethran Sol asked the ship a question then, on an open channel, in a voice that the whole fleet heard and would remember. He asked it why the First Watch had not simply ended the rot. If they knew the word, if the word could not be refused, why had they spent 4 million years holding lines, one world at a time, instead of hunting the gray tide to its last drifting spore, and saying the word over all of it, until the unmaking was gone from the galaxy forever? The Long Morning was quiet for a while. When it answered with the honesty of a thing too old to lie and too tired to soften. "Because there is too much of it," the ancient ship said. "It is everywhere now. It is in the dust between every star. It has been spreading for 4 million years, and it does not gather in one place where the word could reach all of it at once. We are hundreds. The galaxy is vast. We could say the word over the dark for another 4 million years, and not still all of it, because new spores drift out of the deep faster than we can quiet the old ones. We learned this long ago, in our first 1,000 years, when we still believed we could win. We cannot win. There is no winning against a thing that is already everywhere. There is only this. There is being where the green things are when the gray tide comes for them, and saying the word, and holding the line, and moving on to the next. We do not end the unmaking. We outlast it, one world at a time, for as long as there are green things worth standing over. Our makers knew we could not win when they built us. They built us anyway. That is the part you will find hardest to understand, and it is the part that matters most. They built us knowing we would lose, slowly forever, because losing slowly forever was better than the green things losing all at once. So we lose slowly. We have lost slowly for 4 million years, and the worlds we stood over are not lost at all. Yours is one of them. You are welcome." Veteran Soul watched the ancient ship hold back the gray tide, and he could not make sense of what he was seeing. The rot had never been held. That was the first principle, the oldest entry in the Concorde's long catalogue of fear. You did not stop the unmaking. You ran from it, or you burned the ground beneath it, but you did not stop it, because it was not an enemy you could fight. It was a process. You could not threaten a process. You could not outshoot it or outlast it. The Concorde had thrown everything it had at the rot, across 900 years of records, and the rot had eaten all of it and grown stronger. Because to the rot, a weapon was just one more thing to convert. And now a single square plane ship from the dawn of time was holding the gray tide off a lift field with a beam of pale light, and the tide was not converting the light. It was piling up against it. It was, Veteran Soul realized with a slowly rising awe, being denied. He pulled the ancient ship's beam apart on every instrument he had, and what he found made no sense, and then made too much sense. The beam was not energy, as the Concorde understood energy. It was not heat or force or radiation. It was, as near as his analysts could tell, a kind of pattern. The ancient ship was projecting a pattern into the gray tide, and the pattern was an instruction, and the instruction said stop, and it said it in a language the rot itself had been built to obey. Because the rot had been built. That was the thing the Concorde had never known, in 900 years of running from it. The unmaking was not a natural horror that had arisen in the dark. It was a weapon. Someone, in the unimaginable deep of time, had made it. And whoever had made it had also, it seemed, made the key to it, written the off switch into its very design, the way a careful maker builds a lock and then keeps a key. And the ancient ships in the dark line, the first watch, had been built around that key. They were the key. They had been waiting 900,000 years, not to fight the rot, but to turn it off, world by world, the moment it crawled back into the orchard worlds it had first been loosed upon. Veteran Soul's chief analyst, a careful man named Orin who had spent his whole life measuring the rot and being afraid of it, came to the commander with the readout in his hands and a look on his face that Veteran Soul had never seen on him before. Not fear, not the professional dread that was Orin's resting state, something closer to the look of a man who has spent his whole life building a bridge over a river and just watched someone walk across the water beside it. "Commander," Orin said, "we have been doing it wrong. For 900 years, we treated it as a fire, and we fought it with fire. It was never a fire, it was a machine. It was always a machine, and machines can be switched off, and they knew the switch, and we never knew there was a switch to know." He looked up at the great square ship filling the screen. "We burned 3 worlds, Commander. We did not have to burn any of them." Veteran Soul did not answer him. There was no answer that would give Orin back the 3 worlds, or give Veteran Soul back the sleep he had lost over them. There was only the work in front of them, and the work, for the first time in 900 years, was not running. A signal came up from the ancient ship then, and this time it was aimed at the Concorde fleet, and this time the Concorde's translators caught enough of it to understand. The voice was patient. It was very tired in a way that 900 years of war had taught Veteran Soul to recognize, the tiredness of a thing that has done a hard duty for far too long, and intends to do it anyway. "Concorde fleet," the ancient ship said. "We see your lances are charged. We see you mean to burn this moon. Do not. There is no need. The line will hold. The green things will live. Stand down your fire and let us work." Veteran Soul stood down his fire. He would be asked, later, before the Concorde's highest councils, why he had obeyed an unknown ship of unknown origin and unknowable age in defiance of 900 years of standing procedure. He would think about it for a long time before he answered, and when he answered, he would say only this, because it called the orchard a thing worth saving, and in 900 years, no one in the Concorde ever had. We had a procedure for the orchard. It was fire. That ship had a different procedure. It was hold the line. I am an old man, and I have burned 3 worlds, and when something older than the empires told me I did not have to burn a 4th, I believed it, because I wanted to, and because every instinct I had left told me the thing speaking had earned the right to be believed. So the 800 warships of the Third Arm held their fire, and they watched. They watched the first watch come down out of the dark, all of it, hundreds of square plane ships filling the sky of Sodaline 6, and they watched it deploy not as a war fleet deploys, but as something stranger and older, a fleet that knew exactly what it had come to do, and had practiced doing it across a span of time that broke the mind to consider. The ships spread across the moon's sky in a great net, and from each of them came a beam of the pale, patient light, and the beams overlapped and joined, and where they joined they made a single vast dome of pattern over the entire dying moon, and the dome said stop in the language the rot had been built to obey. And the rot stopped. All of it. Not just the tide at the lift field. Every gray haze on every terrace. Every drifting cloud that had been an orchard. The whole conversion the rot had begun that quiet morning, paused, and shuddered, and began to do something no one in the Concord had ever seen the rot do. It began to undo. The gray haze that had been 200-year-old slow fruit trees thinned, and condensed, and fell, and where it fell, there was a residue, fine and pale, settling over the dead terraces like ash, like snow. The tide that had piled against the light receded, not because it chose to, but because the pattern in the light was unmaking the unmaking, reading its instruction backward, telling each spore to be still and stay where it lay, and stop being hungry. The rot did not die, exactly. It went dormant. It went back to being the inert gray dust it had been before someone in the deep of time woke it and aimed it at a galaxy full of green and living things. It took most of a day. That was a thing the Concord had not expected and did not know how to feel about. The first watch did not save the world in a flash, the way the Concord's stories of salvation always went. It saved the world slowly, patiently, terrace by terrace, sweeping the great dome of light back and forth across the gray face of the moon, the way a person sweeps a floor, and the ancient fleet held its station through all of it without strain or haste, because it had nowhere else to be, and nothing else to do, and had not, in 900,000 years, learned how to hurry. The Concord fleet watched the whole long day, and not one ship of it spoke, because there was nothing to say that would not have been small. On the lift field, Pellorin knelt down and put her hand in the pale residue settling over the field, and it was cool, and it was still, and it did not climb her arm or thin her fingers or take her. It just lay there, dead, safe. She picked up a handful of it and let it run through her fingers, and she laughed. A strange high laugh she did not recognize as her own, because she had been ready to die, and now she was not going to, and the woman beside her was crying, and the man beyond him was praying to gods Pell had never heard of, and the girl in her arms reached down and put her own small hand in the residue beside Pell's, copying her, the way children copy the people who are keeping them alive. She found Tolmeric an hour later, alive, on the far side of the field, and she put his daughter back in his arms, and neither of them could speak, so they just held on to each other and the child between them, while above them, the ancient ship that had filled the sky began, gently, to climb back toward the dark. But the long morning did not climb far. It stopped, low over the lift field, and the wide, low door in its flank opened again, and this time, what came from the door was not light. It was a voice. A single voice, in the Concord's own tongue, learned in the few hours since the ancient ship had first heard a Concord transmission, spoken slowly and carefully, and with a warmth that made 40,000 frightened people on a lift field go silent and look up. "You are safe now," the voice said. "The line is held. We are sorry we were late. We have been late before. We are always trying not to be late, and we are always a little late anyway, because the dark is very large and we are very few. But we are here now, and you are safe, and your trees will grow again. We brought the residue down gently, because the residue remembers how to be soil. Plant in it. It will be kind to you. It was orchards once, where we come from. It wants to be orchards again." Pellorin, who kept ledgers and sang badly, and had never held a weapon, stood on the lift field with a handful of dead rot running through her fingers, and she answered the ship the only way she knew how. She did not have words large enough, so she lifted the handful of pale residue toward the great square hull above her, the way you lift a cup to someone who has saved your life, and she said, in a voice that shook, "Thank you." And the ancient ship, 900,000 years old, older than every empire that had ever risen in the galaxy, answered a single orchard keeper, on a single saved moon, with what may have been the gentlest thing anyone in the Concord ever recorded a warship saying. "You are welcome," it said. "Tend them well. We will be watching from the dark, the way we always have. You will not see us, but we will see you. And if the gray tide ever comes again, hold on. We will come. We are always coming. It is the only thing we know how to do." The Concord did not let it rest there, because the Concord was a power, and powers do not let mysteries lie. Within a day, ships came, not the Third Arm's tired warships, but the sleek vessels of the Concord's inquiry service, the ones who cataloged and measured and explained, the ones whose whole purpose was to make the unknown known, and therefore safe. They came to the Orchard Moon to study the first watch, and they came with 1,000 questions, and the first and largest of them was the one Vethron's soul had asked at the very start, in a quiet voice, looking at a shape on a young officer's screen. "How long has that been there?" The answer the inquiry service found was worse than Vethron's soul's guess, and his guess had already broken his arithmetic. The first watch was not 900,000 years old. That was only how long it had been waiting in the dark beyond Sodaline 6. The ships themselves were older, far older. The inquiry service dated the metal of the Long Morning's hull by methods the Concord trusted absolutely, and the methods returned a number that the lead inquirer read 4 times and then walked out of the room to be alone with. The hull of the Long Morning had been forged a little over 4 million years ago, in a foundry under a sun that no longer existed, by hands that had been dust for so long that the dust itself had been recycled into new stars and burned and died again. 4 million years. The Concord, at the height of its pride, was 900 years old. The oldest rival empire in the galaxy, the cold, methodical Valar Imperium, that had ruled the Far Arm before anyone now living was born, could trace its line back perhaps 11,000 years before it collapsed. The most ancient ruin the Concord had ever catalogued, a dead ring city in a system everyone agreed was impossibly old, was 400,000 years dead, and the Concord had built a whole mythology around how ancient that was. The Long Morning had been on patrol, holding its watch in the dark, for 10 times longer than that ring city had been a ruin. It had been old before the ring city was built. It had watched the ring city rise, and shine, and fall, and it had not so much as changed formation, because the rising and falling of empires was not its concern. Its concern was the gray tide, and the orchard worlds, and the line it had been told to hold. The lead inquirer was a careful woman named Savette, and she had spent her career being the person who told the Concord that the impossible was merely the not yet understood. She believed in measurement the way other people believed in gods, and it was Savette who sat with the readout of the Long Morning's age, and felt, for the first time in her life, the floor of the understood world drop away beneath her, because 4 million years was not a number she could measure her way around. It was simply too large. The whole recorded history of every civilization the Concord knew of, stacked end to end, did not reach 1/100th of the way back to the morning the Long Morning was forged. She understood now that she had been cataloging a thin, bright skin on top of an ocean of time, and the ship in front of her had been swimming in that ocean since before the skin formed. The inquirers asked the Long Morning, carefully, where its makers had gone. They expected a tragedy. They got one, but not the kind they expected. The makers were called the Tending Folk, in the only translation the Long Morning could offer, though the ship admitted the word was old even to it, and might have drifted in meaning across 4 million years. They had been, by every account the ship gave, a quiet people, not conquerors, not an empire in the way the Concord understood empires. They had spread slowly across a single arm of the galaxy, terraforming dead worlds into gardens, planting orchards on moons that had never known green, and they had asked very little of the dark except to be left alone to grow things. They had been good at it. They had made paradise after paradise, world after world of slow fruit and singing grass, and the deep, patient forests they loved best. The ship spoke of them the way a very old person speaks of their childhood, in clear, small pictures, with long, dark spaces between, and the inquirers recorded every word, because they understood they were the first beings in 4 million years to hear a dead people described by something that had loved them. The Long Morning remembered the smell of the orchards, or had a memory of the memory of it, written into its oldest banks by makers who had wanted their ships to know what they were fighting for. It remembered a festival the tending folk held at the first fruiting of each season, when the whole of a garden world would gather and sing the trees a song of thanks. It remembered, it said, that its makers had names for every individual tree on the first world they ever planted, thousands of trees, each one named, and that the ship had been built knowing those names, and still knew them, and recited 11 of them to the inquirers before it stopped, because, it said, the inquirers had no soil those trees could grow in, and the names would only be a weight. And then someone, somewhere, had made the rot. The long morning did not know who. It was an old wound, and the ship spoke of it with the careful flatness of a thing that has carried a grief so long it has worn smooth. Someone in the deep of time had built the unmaking as a weapon, to be used against the tending folks' gardens, to turn their paradises gray. And the weapon had worked, at first, better than its makers could have dreamed, and worse than they could have feared. Because a weapon that converts everything it touches into more of itself does not stop when its target is gone. It does not stop at all. The rot ate the tending folks' gardens, and then it ate the people who had loosed it, and then it ate outward into the dark to eat whatever else it found. And it had been eating ever since, drifting between the stars, a slow, gray, patient tide with no master and no off-switch that anyone living knew how to reach. The tending folk had known their gardens were lost. They had known they themselves were dying, and in the time they had left, with the gray tide closing over their last green worlds, they had not built a fleet to flee in, and they had not built a fleet to take revenge with. They had built the first watch. This was the part Sevet asked the ship to repeat, because she could not believe she had understood it. A people facing their own extinction, she said, with time to build one last great thing. And they did not build an ark. They did not build a bomb. They built guardians for strangers who did not yet exist. Yes, the long morning said. That is what they built. It said it simply, the way you state a thing that is so obviously true to you that you cannot understand why it would need to be questioned. We asked them why, some of us, when we were new. We were warships, and a warship wants to understand its purpose, and the purpose seemed strange to us too, at the first. They told us the dark would have other green things in it someday. They told us the gray tide would find those green things, because the tide finds everything green eventually, and there would be no one to stand between them and it, because we, the ones who knew the weapon and the key, would be the last to know. So they made us, and they wrote the key into us. And they told us to wait, and to watch, and to come when the tide came, for green things we would never meet, on worlds that did not yet have names. They could not save themselves. They were very calm about it, at the end. They saved the future instead. We are the shape of that calm. They had built warships, hundreds of them, plain and square and strong, and into each one they had written the key, the off switch, the pattern that told the rot to be still. And they had given the fleet one order, the order that had become a faith across 4 million years. Go into the dark, and wait, and watch. And when the gray tide returns to threaten green and living things, hold the line. Save what can be saved. We could not save ourselves. Save the ones who come after. Save the orchards, wherever you find them, whatever it costs. And then the tending folk had died, all of them, every garden world gone gray, and the first watch had carried out its order for 4 million years, alone, with no one left to thank it, and no one left to call it home. The Concord's inquirers asked the long morning how many worlds it had saved. The ship answered with a number, and the number was 491. 491 worlds, across 4 million years, where the gray tide had come, and the first watch had come faster, and the line had held, and the green things had lived. Most of those worlds had never known the fleet was there. The first watch did its work, and withdrew into the dark, and let the saved go on living, never knowing how close they had come, never knowing who had stood between them and the unmaking. Worlds that had grown into civilizations, worlds that had grown into empires, worlds that had risen and ruled and fallen, all of them owing their existence to a fleet of plain, square ships they had never seen, built by a dead people they had never heard of, holding a line they did not know existed. Sevet asked the ship if the Concorde itself was on the list. There was a long silence, the longest the ship had given them, and then the long morning said yes. 2 of the Concorde's 11,000 worlds had been saved by the first watch. long before the Concord existed, when those worlds were nothing but young green places with no one on them yet to name. The gray tide had come for them, in the deep past, and the line had held, and the green had lived, and grown, and become forests, and become the worlds that the first Sodaline had one day stepped out onto, and called home. The Concord was here, Sevet understood, sitting in this room asking these questions, because 4 million years ago, a dead people had decided that strangers were worth saving. The Concord owed its entire existence to a kindness it had never known about, and could never repay. Sodaline 6 was the 492nd. And then the long morning said something that the lead inquirer wrote down by hand, because she did not trust the recording to carry it the way it deserved to be carried. We do not save worlds because the worlds are owed it, the ship said. We save them because our makers loved green and living things, and they are gone, and we are what is left of that love. A weapon that loves is still a weapon, but it points somewhere different than the others do. We were made to point at the dark, and to keep pointing at it, until the last gray spore is still, or the last of us is dust. We do not expect to be thanked. We were thanked once, today, by a woman with soil in her hands, and it was the first time in 900,000 years, and it will likely be the last for 900,000 more. That is enough. It has to be enough. We have a great deal of dark left to watch. Sevet, who believed in measurement the way other people believed in gods, closed her instruments and put down her stylus, and did the one thing her whole training had taught her never to do in the presence of the unexplained. She stopped trying to explain it. She simply sat with it, in the quiet, the way you sit with something too large and too old, and too kind to be anything but a kind of grace, and she let the unmeasured thing be unmeasured, and she was, for the rest of her long career, a better cataloger of the galaxy for having met the one thing in it she chose not to reduce. Sevet asked the long morning to tell her about one of the worlds, not the number. The number was 491, and the number was too large to feel. She wanted one world, one holding of the line, so that she could carry the truth of it home in a shape a person could hold. The ancient ship chose a world it called, in its translation, the Reed World, and it told the story plainly, and Sevet recorded every word, and the recording became, in time, the most listened thing in the whole vast archive the Concord built around the first watch. The Reed World had come along very early, the ship said, in the first 100,000 years of the watch, when the first watch still numbered more than it did now. It had been a young world, barely green, a single shallow sea, ringed by marshes of tall, pale reeds, and there had been life in the reeds, small, soft swimming things that had not yet learned to think, that were perhaps 100 million years from learning to think, that might never have learned at all. There was no one on the Reed World to call for help. There was no one on the Reed World to know the difference between living and not. By every measure the Concord used to decide what was worth saving, the Reed World was worth nothing. It was mud and water and reeds and small soft things that did not even have names for themselves. The gray tide came for it anyway, the way the gray tide came for everything green, and the first watch came faster, and held the line over a world with no one on it to thank them, and quieted the unmaking, and saved the reeds and the shallow sea and the small soft swimming things that did not know they had been saved. And then the fleet withdrew into the dark, and watched that world for a while, the ship said, longer than it usually watched, because the Reed World was beautiful, in a way the fleet had not expected, all silver water, and pale reeds bending in a wind no one was there to feel. Sevet asked what had become of it. The ship told her. The small soft swimming things had gone on swimming, and changed, slowly, across the long dark span the ship had watched, and the longer span after it stopped watching, and the Reed World was, the ship believed, though it could not be sure, one of the two Concord worlds the first watch had saved before the Concord existed. The reeds were forests now. The shallow sea was an ocean. The small, soft swimming things that did not know they had been saved had become, across millions of years, a people who built ships and charted the dark and called themselves the Sodaline, and never once, in all their proud history, wondered why their world had not gone gray when so many others had. They did not wonder because they did not know there had been anything to wonder about. The line had held over their cradle while they were still mud, and the holding had been so quiet and so complete that not even a story of it survived, and the Sodaline had grown up believing, the way young peoples do, that they had made themselves. Sevet sat with that for a long time. She was Sodaline. Everyone in the room was Sodaline. The whole Concord, 11,000 worlds and 900 years of pride, had grown out of a marsh of pale reeds that a fleet of dead strangers had decided, for no reason but love, was worth standing over, when it was nothing but mud and small soft things that could not even feel afraid. We did not save the reed world because it would become you, the long morning said, because Sevet had not asked but the ship had heard the question under her silence. We could not know it would become you. We did not save it for what it would become. We saved it because it was green, and the green things were what our makers loved, and you do not stand over a thing only when you can be certain it will repay you. That is not standing over a thing. That is investing in it. Our makers did not invest. They loved. There is a difference, and it is the whole difference. And it is why we are still here, and the ones who made the gray tide are not. The makers of the unmaking built a thing that took. The makers of the first watch built a thing that stood. The thing that takes ate its makers, and is now a mindless tide, drifting in the dark, with no one left to aim it. The thing that stands is still standing, and it saved your cradle, and today it saved your moon, and it will go on standing, over green things, until the last of us is dust, and it has never once asked the green things to deserve it. You do not have to deserve it. No one ever has. That is what makes it worth giving. The Concord's councils argued for a long time about what the First Watch was. Some called it a threat. Hundreds of warships older than every empire in the galaxy, carrying a weapon that could stop the unstoppable rot, answering to no power and recognizing no border, moving where it pleased, and burning nothing, only because it chose not to. A power like the Concord did not survive 900 years by trusting things it could not control, and the First Watch could not be controlled. The argument had weight. Vethron Sol sat through every hour of it, an old burner of worlds in a room full of people who had never had to give the order he had given 3 times, and he let them argue, and then he stood up and said his piece. You are asking the wrong question, he told the council. You are asking whether you can trust them. Trust does not enter into it. They do not need your trust. They have not needed it for 4 million years. They held the line at Sodaline 6, while our lances were charged to burn that moon, and they held it not for us but for the orchard, and the orchard does not know the difference between Concord soil and any other soil. They will hold the line for our worlds exactly as readily as for a world that never heard the Concord's name, because the only thing they see when they look at us is green and living things worth saving. There is no power in the galaxy that has ever looked at the Concord that way. Not one. Stop asking whether you can trust them. Ask whether you deserve them. Then go and try to. There was an old counselor named Hask who had argued hardest that the fleet was a danger, and Hask stood after Vethron Sol and said, with the honesty that sometimes comes to proud people when they are cornered by something true, that he was afraid, not of the fleet attacking, of the fleet's example. Because the Concord had spent 900 years measuring everything by what it cost and what it returned, and here was a thing that had spent 4 million years giving everything and asking nothing, and if that was real, if a weapon could be built out of love and pointed at the dark for the sake of strangers, then the Concord had been small for a very long time, and no one likes to learn they have been small. The council went quiet at that, because it was true, and they knew it was true, and the knowing was the first thing in 900 years that had ever made the Concord want to be larger than it was. The council did not have an answer for Vethron Sol, or for Hask. So it did the only thing a wise power can do when it meets something larger than itself. It got out of the way. The Concord declared the First Watch a sovereign presence, beholden to no border and subject to no law but its own. It opened the orchard worlds to the fleet, all 11,000 of them, with a standing offer the Concord had never extended to anyone in 900 years. Come and go as you please, and if you ever need anything, anything at all, you have only to ask. The First Watch thanked the Concord, in its patient, tired way, and asked for nothing, because there was nothing in the gift of any living power that a 4-million-year-old fleet of the dead's last love could possibly need. But it accepted one thing. It accepted the soil. This was Pel-Aren's doing, and she never quite understood how it became hers to do, except that she had been the woman with soil in her hands, and the ship remembered her. And when the Concorde asked the first watch whether there was truly nothing it wanted, the long morning had answered that it would like, if it was not too much, to know that the orchards it saved were growing. Not to be paid, not to be thanked, just to know. After 4 million years of saving worlds it never saw again, the ship had said, it would be a kindness to see one of them grow. So Pel Arin became something the Concorde had no title for, and had to invent one. She became the keeper of the keepers. She stayed on Sodaline 6, where the pale residue of the dead rot turned out to be the richest soil anyone had ever planted in, exactly as the ship had promised. And she replanted her grandmother's terraces, and the slow fruit grew back faster and sweeter than it had ever grown before, because it was growing in soil that had once been the gardens of the tending folk. 4 million years dead, come home at last, in the worst possible way, and made gentle again by the fleet their love had built. The keeping of the keepers became Pel Arin's whole life, and it was a stranger life than she could have imagined for the orchard keeper she had been on the morning the gray tide came. She had never wanted to be important. She had wanted the terraces, and the slow fruit, and the quiet ledgers, and the bad songs she sang to the trees when she thought no one could hear. The Concorde gave her a title she had not asked for, and could not refuse. And with the title came people, scholars and officials, and the merely curious, who came to Sodaline 6 to see the woman the oldest ships in the galaxy had remembered, and Pel received them all with the same patience she gave to a stubborn graft that would not take. And she told them the same thing every time, which was that she was not important, that the trees were important, that the ship had not remembered her, it had remembered the soil in her hands, and the soil was the point, and she was only the one who happened to be holding it. But the work of the keeping was real, and she did it well. She learned the old patient band the way she had learned the slow grammar of the orchard, by living with it, by sending and waiting and listening, and over the years, she came to understand the first watch a little, the way you come to understand a quiet neighbor you never quite see. She learned that the fleet did not like to be thanked too much, that a single thank you landed, but a flood of them seemed to make it withdraw, the way a person worn down by hardship grows shy of too much kindness all at once. She learned that it liked, more than thanks, to be told that the trees were growing, plain news of green things, the simple report that the work had held. So that was what she sent, every season, plain news. The East Terraces fruited heavy this year. The new grafts took. The children planted a row of singing grass from a seed the archive kept and it came up silver. The orchard lives. And 3 words always came back. We are watching. She came, over the years, to think she understood what those 3 words were doing, and she never told anyone, because it was the kind of understanding that sounds foolish, said out loud, and is true anyway. The fleet was not reassuring her that it stood guard, though it did. It was telling her, she thought, the only comfort a thing as old and tired and alone as the first watch had left to give. After 4 million years of saving worlds it never saw again, of holding lines and withdrawing into the dark, and never knowing whether the green things it had saved went on to grow or wither. Here at last was one world it could watch. One orchard it could see growing, season by season, in real and certain news from a woman with soil in her hands. The 3 words were not for her. They were the fleet telling itself, in the only words it had, that this time it would get to see. This time it would not have to wonder. The orchard of Sodaline 6 was the first watch's window onto the thing it had spent 4 million years protecting, and almost never been allowed to witness, which was simply green things growing, safe, because the line had held. We are watching meant we get to watch this one. We get to see it live. After all this time, we get to see. So Pel Arin grew the orchard not only for the town, and not only for herself, but for the fleet in the dark that had nothing left in the galaxy to look at, that was as good as a tree it had saved going on living. She planted more than the terraces needed. She planted the high slopes that her grandmother had never bothered with, and the old dry quarter that had never held water, and she made the orchard of Sodaline 6 larger and greener and stranger and more beautiful than any orchard had ever been on any world, because she had an audience that had waited 4 million years to enjoy one, and she did not intend to give that audience a small show. She gave it everything she had. She gave it a whole moon turned green out of the residue of its own murder. And every season, she told the dark what was growing. And every season the dark told her it was watching. And across the cold span between the moon and the patient fleet there passed, season after season, the oldest and simplest exchange there is, the one a gardener and a guardian have always shared, even when the gardener is one tired woman, and the guardian is a fleet of ships older than the stars they hide among. Here is the thing we love. It is alive. We are watching it live. That was enough. The fleet had said so. It had to be enough. And on the orchard moon of Sodaline 6, season after season, year after year, it was. The work was not small, and Pell did not do it alone. The town came back, what was left of it, the 60,000 who had lifted off, and the 40,000 who had stood on the field, waiting to die and lived instead. And they came up the switchback road that the gray tide had come down, and they found their terraces dead and gray-dusted and impossible. And Pell taught them what the ship had taught her, which was to plant in the residue and trust it. The first season was hard. People did not believe the pale dust would do anything but kill what they put in it, because the pale dust had been the thing that killed everything, and it took a kind of faith to push a seed into the ash of your own murdered orchard and wait. But the seeds came up. They came up green and strong and faster than they should have, and the second season was easier, and by the fifth season, the terraces of Sodaline 6 were greener than they had been before the rot ever came, and the slow fruit hung heavy and sweet on trees that grew in the bodies of trees 4 million years older than themselves. And every season, when the trees fruited, Pell Aran sent the harvest record up into the dark on the old patient band the long morning had first spoken on, a single signal that said only this: they are growing, the orchard lives. Thank you for the morning. And every season, from somewhere in the cold dark beyond the moon, where the first watch had withdrawn to resume the watch it had never truly left, an answer came back. 3 words. In the Concorde's tongue the ship had learned in a few hours on the day it saved a world. We are watching. That was all. That was everything. The fleet did not stay idle in the dark, and Pell came to know its rhythms, the way you come to know the habits of a quiet neighbor. Twice in her lifetime the first watch left its station beyond Sodaline 6 and was gone for a season or two, and both times the Concorde's far stations would later report, in tones of careful wonder, that the gray tide had appeared at the edge of some distant system, some young green world no one was watching, and then simply stopped and gone dormant, and the world had lived, and no one on it had ever known why. The first watch told no one when it went or where. It just went, and held the line, and came back, and resumed its watch over the orchard worlds, and added one more to a tally it had been keeping since before the galaxy had empires to keep tallies of their own. The gray tide tested the new understanding once more in Pell Aran's lifetime, and the test was how the Concorde learned that it had truly changed. It came in her middle years, when the terraces of Sodaline 6 were green again, and the story of the morning had already begun turning into a song. The rot appeared at the edge of a Concorde system 3 arms away, a young colony world called Ember's Rest, 40 million people, too many to evacuate, and far too large to burn. In the old days that were only a few decades gone, that sentence would have been a death sentence for 40 million people, and the Concorde would have written it down in its careful volumes, and grieved in its careful way, and done nothing, because there had been nothing to do. The gray tide had come for a world too big to save, and the Concorde's only answer had always been the lance and the fire, and the lance and the fire could not be turned on 40 million living people. But the Concorde was not the Concorde it had been. It had spent decades studying the pattern the first watch projected, the older word, the be still written into the heart of the gray tide, and it had not been able to build the word itself, because the word was woven into the ancient ships at a level the Concorde could read but not yet make. What the Concorde had learned instead was how to ask. It had learned, from Pell Aran's harvest signals and the 3 quiet words that came back, that the first watch could be reached, and that the first watch came when green things were threatened, and that all you had to do, the whole of the great secret, was tell it where. So the Concorde told it where. The moment the rod appeared at Ember's Rest, the Concorde did not charge its lances. It sent a signal into the dark, on the old patient band, the band Pell Aran used to report her harvests, and the signal said only this: the gray tide has come to Ember's Rest, 40 million green and living things. We cannot hold the line. Please come. And then the Concorde did the hardest thing a proud power can do, which was wait, and trust, and keep its fire cold while a world full of its own people stood under the rising gray. The first watch came. Of course it came. It had never not come. It came faster than the Concorde believed anything that old could move, and it spread its net over Ember's Rest, and it said the word, and the gray tide on 40 million people's world lay down and went still, and the residue fell soft and pale over the cities and the fields. And 40 million people who had been told they were going to die went out into their streets and looked up at the oldest ships in the galaxy and did not have words, the way Pel'Arin had not had words, and the first watch told them, in their own tongue learned in an afternoon, the same thing it had told a frightened woman on a lift field decades before. You are safe now. Plant in the residue. It wants to be orchards again. Vethran Sol was very old by then, older than any commander had a right to be, and he heard the news of Ember's Rest from his bed, and the man who brought it to him said the commander wept, which the man had never seen him do. Vethran Sol had burned 3 worlds in his time, 3 worlds the Concorde had not known how to save, and now a 4th world the size of all 3 of them together had been saved without a single life lost, because the Concorde had finally learned the one thing the first watch had been trying to teach it since the morning over Sodaline 6. You do not have to win against the dark. You only have to know who to call, and then you have to be the kind of people who call. The Concorde had become the kind of people who call. It had taken 900 years of pride and 1 morning of awe to make them, but they had become it, and Vethran Sol, who had burned worlds because he had not known any better, lived just long enough to see his people learn better, and he counted that the great mercy of his long, hard life. After Ember's Rest, the Concorde stopped keeping the first watch a secret. It had tried, at the first, the way powers try to keep frightening wonders to themselves. It stopped. It told the 11,000 worlds the truth, all of it, the dead tending folk, and the 4 million years, and the 491 worlds, and the word written in the heart of the gray tide, and it taught every world the band and the signal, so that any world that ever saw the gray haze on its horizon would know, in the same breath, both to be afraid and what to do about the fear. The fear of the rot did not leave the orchard worlds. It never would. But it changed its shape. It stopped being the fear of a thing that could not be answered, and became the fear of a thing that could, which is a smaller and more bearable fear. The fear of a child who is frightened of the dark, but knows that someone will come if it calls. The orchard worlds called the first watch, in the years after, by a name the Concorde had not chosen for it, and could not have. They called it the Ones Who Come. Years passed. Pel'Arin grew old in the orchard she had been ready to die in, and she kept her ledgers, and she sang badly, and she sent her harvest record up into the dark every season, and every season 3 words came back. She married, late, a quiet man from the town, who had been on the field that day too, and she raised children in the terraces, and she told them the story of the morning, the sky filled with the oldest ships in the galaxy, and they believed her, the way children believe a thing their mother saw with her own eyes. The Concorde went on being a power, and rose, and would someday fall, because that is what powers do, and the first watch took no notice of the rising or the falling, because that had never been its concern. Its concern was the gray tide, and somewhere out in the long dark of the galaxy, the gray tide was still drifting, still patient, still hungry, still looking for green and living things to convert into more of itself. It found them, now and again. It always had. And every time it found them, every time the unmaking crawled out of the dark toward some world that did not even know to be afraid, a line of plain square ships, older than every empire that had ever flown a flag, came down out of the cold, and held the line, and turned the gray tide still, and withdrew again into the dark before the saved world ever learned how close it had come. 492 became 493. 493 became 494. The number climbed, season by season, world by world, a tally kept by a fleet of the dead's last love, growing in the dark like the slow fruit grew in Pel'Arin's terraces, patient and sweet and impossible to hurry. The Concorde wrote it all down, of course. It was a power, and powers write things down. The official record ran to many volumes, full of dates and dimensions and the careful measured findings of the Inquiry Service, and it explained the first watch as thoroughly as anything that old can be explained. But the part of the record that anyone actually remembered, the part that got told and retold across the orchard worlds until it stopped being a record, and became something closer to a song, was not in any of the volumes. It was the thing the long morning had said to a frightened woman on a lift field, on the day the gray tide came to Sodaline 6, and met, for the first time in 900 years, something it could not unmake. You are safe now. We are sorry we were late. Plant in the residue. It wants to be orchards again. Veteran Soul lived long enough to see the terraces green again. He came to Sodaline 6 once, an old man by then, no longer a commander of anything, and Pell walked him through the orchard that had grown out of the residue, and he did not say much, because there was not much an old burner of worlds could say in a place that proved he had never needed to burn them. At the end of the walk he stopped at the high terrace where it had all begun, and he looked up at the dark and he said, to no one, to the fleet he could not see, I am sorry I learned so late. Then he went home, and he did not burn another world, because no one in the Concord ever had to again, because the Concord had learned the key, and the key was patience, and the key was holding the line, and the Concord had learned it from a teacher older than itself by 4 million years. Pell Oren lived a long life, and she was an old woman when she died, in the shade of trees her grandmother had planted, and the gray tide had killed, and the dead's last love had brought back to life. And the last thing she did, the morning of the day she died, was climb to the high terrace, where it had all begun, with a grafting knife in her hand, because there was always pruning to be done, and look up at the dark beyond the orchard moon, where she could not see the ships, but knew, beyond any doubt, that the ships could see her. She did not have the strength to send a formal record that morning, so she just spoke, the way she had spoken the very first time, with no words large enough, and so using small ones. The orchard lives, she said to the dark. I tended them well, like you asked. Thank you for the morning. Thank you for all of them. And from the cold dark beyond Sodaline 6, where the first watch had kept its watch for 900,000 years, and would keep it for 900,000 more, where ships older than the galaxy's oldest empire waited in perfect patient silence for the gray tide to come again, the answer came back one last time, on the old band, in 3 quiet words, the way it always had, and the way it always would, long after Pell Oren was gone, and her grandchildren tended the trees, and forgot the song, and remembered it again. We are watching. The dark did not win that day. It had not won at Sodaline 6, and it had not won at the 491 worlds before it, and it would not win at the worlds still to come, because somewhere out in the long, cold patience of the galaxy, older than the empires, older than the very memory of empires, a fleet built by a dead people, out of nothing but love, was still holding the line. It would always be a little late. It said so itself, but it would always, always come. And the orchards grew.